What's up, brothers and sisters? You know I love dealing with the facts. Real history over fake history, you feel me? So here's the deal. My new segment is called 5 Minutes of Facts. Sit back and relax and let's give them this work.
We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all that overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not we think it's a good thing. We say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried.
And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted the national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. The liberals and conservatives hold it. The blacks and whites hold it. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no basis to it whatsoever. The racial segregation in every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit government policy designed to create racial boundaries, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, with policies that are so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape that we see in cities all over the country. Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites, in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if it wanted the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing on temporary housing because the explicit goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and near the shipyards, and they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans. And then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing.
The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects.
Part 2 already posted. Go get that work.